Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us for another of our Discover Wildlife evenings. My name is Ian Lloyd. I'm one of the product managers here at Wildlife Wide and the Travelling Naturalist. This evening, I'm thrilled to be joined by Nick Garbutt for our Discover Madagascar talk. Hello, Nick.
Good evening, Ian. Good evening, everyone. Nice to
Our
be
talk,
here.
great. Our talk this evening will be about 45 minutes to an hour. Please use the Q&A and the chat functions if you would like to ask questions. We will go through some of these at the time, and some we will go through at the end of the talk with Nick. We will also have a poll at the end of the trip where you'll have the opportunity to request a travel plan for the talk you'll hear more about this evening. I'm sure most of you know Nick already. He's one of our most experienced tour leaders, a phenomenal photographer, and an author on many of the wildlife books about Madagascar. So we're in for a treat tonight. And if you're ready, Nick, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Ian. Once again, good evening, everyone. Glad you could join us. I'm going to talk in general terms about Madagascar this evening, but also with an emphasis and leaning towards the Festival of Wildlife that Wildlife Worldwide are organising for next year, end of October into November 2026. So that will form the bulk of the talk, but there'll be a bit of general intro to get us going. I suspect for most people of my vintage and older, their first introduction to anything to do with Madagascar may well have been Animal Magic and dear old Dotty the ring-tailed lemur with Johnny Morris. It wasn't my introduction. I predate that insofar as my first memory or recollection of anything to do with Madagascar was a result of this program, not when it was first broadcast, I hasten to add, which I think was 1959, before I was born. But I have very distinct memories of seeing this program when I was in Canada. I had 2 years as a kid in Canada when my parents were teaching. And I remember being in the apartment we had in Montreal, probably in 1969 or something like that, and watching a rerun of Zoo Quest to Madagascar with, of course, David Attenborough. And even back then, just remember being utterly enthralled, seeing black and white footage of sifakas, etc. There were indri and so forth, all very jerky footage, obviously very difficult for them to film back then with the cumbersome equipment that they had. And a lot of the wildlife wasn't habituated like it is now, so tracking them down was difficult. But there was one story or one storyline that I particularly resonated with me, and for whatever reason stuck in my head as a kid, soaking up any animal fact that I could. And it was David Attenborough finding fragments of egg and piecing them together from this mystical, mythical creature, and coming up with this giant egg. And of course, as a 6-year-old, 5-year-old kid, the idea of an egg of this magnitude just absolutely flabbergasted me and thrilled me and excited me and interested me. And that egg belongs to this bird, sadly now extinct, of course, became extinct about 1,000 years ago. This is the elephant bird, or Aepyornis, probably the largest bird that's ever lived, and by consequence, laid the largest egg that we know of. So those eggs are occasionally still found, and David Attenborough managed to piece that egg together. And then I know from bits and pieces I've read and so forth that he then had it professionally restored. So it's one of his prized possessions to have an actual Aepyornis egg. And these things are incredibly valuable. If you were lucky enough to find an absolutely intact one, which still does happen very, very occasionally, or one comes onto the market from a museum or so forth, you could expect to pay somewhere in the region of £50,000 for an intact aepyornis or elephant bird egg. But this sort of thing absolutely fascinated me, and I have a recollection from the early 70s of listening to one of the quiz programs. It might have been something like Brain of Britain with what was his name? Robert Robinson, was it, or something like that? And asking a question about what is an aepyornis and where did it live? And I was able to answer it at age 6 or 7, which utterly stunned my parents, as I recall. But that was how my sort of introduction to Madagascar came about. And I'm pleased to say, or delighted to say, that that is actually my aepyornis egg. And just to give you an idea of size, there you go. There is an aepyornis egg made from fragments, this one, but somewhere in the region of 10 to 12 litres, 150 to 200 chicken egg equivalents. So quite special. So that gives you an idea of why Madagascar just fascinated me from an early age. But it wasn't until 1991 that I went for the first time. That photograph on the left, just over 30 years ago, whatever it is, 34 years ago, I went for the first time. And I've been most years since, COVID accepted. I didn't go for 2 years, but subsequently, all the way up to last year, the photograph on the right with my good friend and top guide, Heri Andriani Antifana, who, if you come on the festival, you will meet. So I've been utterly enthralled by Madagascar for a long period of time. And that fascination with the island and its wildlife remains as strong today as it ever was. So why is that? What makes Madagascar so compelling, enthralling? I think in a nutshell, it's because it is so different. It's often referred to as another continent. It's not like Africa. It might be close to Africa in some sort of geographic sense, but in terms of its wildlife and the habitats, the feel of the place, the culture of the place, it couldn't be more different to Africa. If anything, certain elements are more like Southeast Asia, but it's almost an otherworldly sort of experience. And the kind of forests that you visit and the wildlife you encounter in those forests is so different. This is Western Madagascar, famous in some areas for baobabs, of course. Most people might be familiar with baobabs from Africa, where there's a single species. There's also a single species in Australia, but the other 6 that occur are only found in Madagascar. And not only are the habitats different and unique to the island, an awful lot, if not the vast majority of the wildlife is unique. Over 50% of all the world's chameleons are found on Madagascar. It's quite possible that chameleons first evolved in Madagascar and then spread out subsequently thereafter. Even the frogs, which obviously look like frogs elsewhere, but in terms of species, 95+% are endemic to the island, i.e. found absolutely nowhere else. The birds too, very high percentage, over 65%, are unique to the island. This is one of the most celebrated, a helmet vanga. The vanga family, again, is largely restricted to the island of Madagascar. And this is a recurring theme. Every time I show you a picture, mention something, I will say, it's endemic to Madagascar. It's the only place that it occurs. Some of the smaller mammals that the island's famous for, including tenrecs, small insectivore type mammals that do have relatives in Africa and elsewhere, but tenrecs themselves are endemic to the island. And even some of the carnivores, in fact, all of the carnivores are endemic to the island. And there's a small number, there are only 8 or 9, depending on the taxonomy you use. And while some of them resemble carnivores elsewhere, they're utterly unique to the island. They, in fact, form their own family, the Eupleridae, which is unique to the island. This perhaps is the most celebrated, the largest carnivore in Madagascar, the fossa. But of course, I think if you had to pick one animal group above any other to represent and to epitomize Madagascar, it would be the lemurs, and perhaps none more so than the ring-tailed lemur, which ironically is atypical as far as lemurs are concerned because it's partially terrestrial. Virtually all the other lemurs are primarily tree-dwelling. They're primarily arboreal. but ringtails spend a lot of time actually on the ground, and therefore are quite different to the majority of their kin. And I'll come back to this later, they're becoming increasingly rare and endangered, which is obviously a feature, or is a feature, that is true of an awful lot of the wildlife in Madagascar. And other things for which the island is, of course, is so familiar, sifakas, some of which dance across open spaces and form one of the endearing images that is associated with Madagascar. This is a Vero sifaka dancing across open spaces in southern Madagascar. And to epitomize the weird, wacky, and bizarre, I suspect no animal does that better than the eye, which is a type of lemur. Doesn't really look like a primate, but it is, and in many respects fills an ecological niche that you'd perhaps associate more with a woodpecker, because they gnaw into rotten wood and winkle out insect grubs, much like a woodpecker would chisel out insect grubs using its beak. The eye does it using a combination of its teeth and its fingers. So why is Madagascar so different? Well, in a nutshell, it's all to do with isolation. If you wind the clock back an awful long time, in this case, 500 million years, Madagascar sat right at the heart of a giant supercontinent. All of those land masses that you see represented there were probably all clustered and joined together, with Madagascar right in the middle. This is sort of the giant continent we generally refer to as Gondwana land. And then some 200 million years ago or so, it gradually began to fragment. And if you follow the chronology of that diagram through, you'll see that Madagascar started to become isolated, at least from mainland Africa, somewhere around 100 million years ago. And then around 88 million years ago, what we now know as India split away from Madagascar and started to drift north. Eventually, 40 odd million years ago, clattered into what we now know as Asia and formed the Himalayas. But Madagascar was left behind in isolation in the Indian Ocean. And so effectively, what is on Madagascar now is there as a consequence of being isolated for over 88 million years. Now, of course, 60 odd million years ago, there was a mass extinction across the vast majority of the Earth's surface, including wiping out all of the dinosaurs and all sorts of other species that had dominated prior to that. So we know that Madagascar, the slate, to a certain extent, was wiped clean when that event occurred, and therefore everything we see today has arrived on Madagascar subsequent to that, which means it has to have come across water. It's rafted across from land masses, in all likelihood, Africa for the vast majority of land-dwelling species. And that's acted as a huge filter and has limited which species, which groups of animals have actually arrived on Madagascar. But once they were on Madagascar, they started to evolve in ways so different to anywhere else in the world, hence the levels of uniqueness that you see on the island. So I'm now going to talk more specifically about two of the locations on Madagascar that are prime wildlife spots and feature in the Festival of Wildlife that we're running next year. The two wildlife hotspots in question are Andazi Bay Mantadea National Park, which I know it's not easy to see on the map on the right, but is number 1, which is the red dot just above halfway on the right-hand side. And that's a rainforest reserve. And then the second reserve that we'll be visiting during the main part of the festival is in dry forest on the coast, on that northwestern coast. So you can see where the number 5 is, or there is a single green star touching the coast on that northwest edge of the island. And that's Anjajavi Private Reserve. And those are the two locations that we will be featuring during the main Festival of Wildlife. And they've been selected for two reasons. First and foremost, they're utterly fantastic wildlife locations, but they also offer readily accessible wildlife. Um, you will see from that map where I've highlighted a lot of the wildlife hotspots around the island. A lot of them are dotted around the periphery of the island, and therefore getting from one to another is very time consuming. So on any normal tour of Madagascar, it's impossible to do everything. You have to cherry pick which places you want to go to. And on a regular tour that I would do, for instance, you'd go to 4 or 5 of these in a 2.5 to 3 week period. And which ones you visit will dictate which species you see. So initially, I'm going to talk about rainforests. This is obviously wonderful rainforest coming down to the shoreline in Madagascar in the northeast. Andazime Mantadia is in the central eastern part of the island, in slightly more montane forests, slightly higher elevations, roughly about 900 to 1,000 meters in elevation. And it's arguably the premier rainforest site on the island. A, because it's so diverse, there's so much to see. There are so many different portions of this park, either parts of the park that are officially within the park structure, or there are private reserves or reserves run by conservation agencies around the periphery, which means altogether there is a wonderful diversity of different opportunities to experience different sorts of habitat, mainly different types of rainforest, but where all sorts of different species can be seen relatively easily. This is Mantadia National Park itself, one of the most beautiful bits of montane rainforest on the island. This is, again, Mantadia National Park, which is one of the quieter corners of this particular area, which is one of the most popular rainforest reserves on the island. But because it has so many different facets, it's very easy to get away from where other people might be and wander around. What I should have perhaps mentioned earlier is that all wildlife watching in Madagascar is on foot. So you're wandering around in these forests on foot wherever you may be, and therefore discovering what there is to see as you're wandering around, which in itself adds an awful lot to the experience. So this is wonderful rainforest and a host of things. And one of the features of anything to do with Madagascar is just how weird and wonderful and often wacky many of the animals are, perhaps none more so than this giraffe-necked weevil, this wonderful creature. This is a male, is often found on this particular species of plant called Diacantantera, where it feeds. And it also, the males also use their long neck to roll a single leaf into which a female then lays an egg. So quite an unusual behavior for an insect. Other fantastic insects that you might see in this rainforest reserve would be something like a comet moth here, which has a wingspan of 15 to 20 centimeters, a huge moth, obviously utterly spectacular. Plants too are often interesting and in most cases unique to the island. This particular orchid is worth mentioning for the simple reason it's called Angraecum. There's a whole cluster of orchids belonging to the genus Angraecum, and this particular species is Angraecum sesquipedale. And when Charles Darwin was shown a specimen of this particular orchid with this wonderful long nectary that is somewhere between 25 and 30 centimeters in length, Darwin immediately said, I bet there, he probably said, I wager, given the period of time, that there is a moth, a hawk moth in Madagascar that has a tongue the same length as that nectary. And at the time he was scoffed at. Nobody could conceive of the notion of a moth having a tongue that was the best part of 10 to 12 inches in length. And then something like 50 or 60 years later, that moth was found and was named Xanthopan morgani predictor in honor of Darwin's prediction. And this is a species that, if you are very lucky, you can actually see in Andasi Bay as well. Very difficult to see them feeding on the orchid, of course, but nonetheless, they occur. It's one of the richest sites in Madagascar for frogs. As I mentioned earlier, 95+% of all frogs in Madagascar are only found on Madagascar. lots of different sorts of tree frogs, many of which don't have common names. They just have scientific names. This spotted tree frog belongs to the genus Buphis, as does this wonderful camouflaged moss mimicking tree frog. Some of the larger ones that are a little easier to find. This is the giant leaf litter frog, which is often found up in trees as well. But these are all things that on a regular night walk in the Andasi Bay area, you would have a chance of seeing. Reptiles too, lots of reptiles other than the chameleons that I've already mentioned. This is a Madagascar tree boa. There are no venomous snakes in Madagascar, which obviously is pleasing for some people because there's nothing to worry about in that regard. They're all harmless and very confiding, easily approachable, and often make fantastic photographic subjects, as you can see here. They're not as large as some of the constrictors, say, in Southeast Asia or on the African mainland. A large individual of this particular species might be a meter long, something like that, maybe a little more. So they're not huge snakes, but they're still hugely impressive. And of course, going back to the theme of chameleons, wonderful diversity in Andasi Bay. This is one of the most special, really small chameleons. This is called the lance-nosed chameleon. And at the opposite end of the scale, the largest of all chameleons, the parsons, a huge thing which can be 60 plus centimeters in length from nose tip to tail tip. And some really special ones in the upland areas of Andasi Bay. This is the green-eared chameleon, or Caluma malthi, if you use its scientific name. Not an easy species to see, but obviously spectacular nonetheless. And at the opposite end of the scale, if you grub around on the leaf litter on the forest floor, you might get lucky and find a leaf chameleon or stump-tailed chameleon, very much smaller, mimics, as you can see from this, shriveled or dead leaves, and is active during the day and hunts mites and tiny, tiny insects in the leaf litter. Some of these chameleons are amongst the smallest reptiles in the world. And to give you an idea of scale, that particular one, it's a species that's only found in the very north of Madagascar, so it's not one we'd see on the main part of the festival. But that's one of the smallest reptiles in the world, the pygmy stump-tailed chameleon. And there are some spectacular exponents of camouflage as well, perhaps none more so than the leaf-tailed gecko, in this case the mossy leaf-tailed gecko, which is there plastered against the bark of this tree trunk, characteristically sleeping during the day with its head down and its body flattened against the bark. And they have a frill of skin going all around the periphery, including around the legs and the feet. And that frill of skin helps blend their outline imperceptibly into the tree bark so they don't throw any shadow, which of course then adds to the camouflage and means or makes it increasingly difficult for predators to detect them. There's another one on the tree trunk there on the right-hand side, if you can make it out, but you can see that their degree of camouflage is quite spectacular. At night, when they're active, they look like this. So they're much easier to find at night. And on any regular night walk in the Andasi Bay area, this is certainly something you would hope to see active and hunting at night. As a group, the leaf-tailed geckos fit neatly into two sort of camps. The larger ones tend to mimic tree bark, like this particular mossy leaf-tailed gecko. There are smaller ones which mimic dead and shriveled dry leaves, and this particular species is often called the satanic leaf-tailed gecko because it obviously looks quite devil-like and has the wonderful name of Uroplatus fantasticus. One of the main predators of leaf-tailed geckos is another endemic bird or group of birds, the couas, that are related to cuckoos. They're part of the cuckoo family in the very general sense. And if you're familiar with birds in Africa, you can certainly see a resemblance there to a turco. This is the blue cua, which is one of the arboreal species and is a particular predator of leaf-tailed geckos. And they spend a lot of time simply searching, perched still in the canopy, searching every branch and along every tree line of bark and so forth, hoping to actually find a leaf-tailed gecko. Lots of birds, as I mentioned, are unique to the island. I showed you a picture earlier of the helmet vanga. This is one of the smaller vangas. Used to be called Ward's flycatcher, but recent taxonomic changes have realigned this bird with the vangas, and it's now called Ward's flycatcher vanga. Um, and other groups of birds that are peculiar to the island, ground rollers. There are only 5 species, four of which occur in rainforests. One occurs in the dry areas of the southwest, which I'll come on to later. But these are very heavily or highly sought after by keen bird watchers because they're endemic and they're quite spectacular. This bird is about the size of a blackbird, but they skulk around in the darker recesses of the rainforest on the floor, so are quite challenging to see. You often hear them calling, but more difficult to see. As I mentioned, there are 4 in rainforest areas. I'll show you pictures of 3 of them. This is a scaly ground roller. This particular one here is pitta-like ground roller. And the largest one is the short-legged ground roller. And these are all birds that you would have a chance to see in Andasi Bay, Mantadi, or the other areas that we potentially will visit in the vicinity when we're running the festival. Even the rodents are unique to the island. This is one of the tufted-tailed rats. There are actually only 5 mammal groups that occur on Madagascar. The bats are one, which I'll mention again later, and you can guess that they arrived on Madagascar by flying. The 4 purely terrestrial groups are the rodents, the lemurs, the primates, the carnivores, and the tenrecs. And all of those 4 groups, or each of those 4 groups, the ancestor of those 4 groups probably arrived on Madagascar by rafting on bits of vegetation that were blown out from, in all likelihood, the African mainland during a big storm, and gradually over 2 or 3, 4 weeks, drifted across the Mozambique Channel, arrived on Madagascar, and allowed the island to be colonized. Now, that's happened over the last roughly 55 million years, and there have only been 4 occurrences, which tells you how rare that is, which is why there are only 4 mammal groups on the island. But once those groups arrived or individuals arrived, and by definition, that has to be either a male and female pair arrived on floating vegetation or a pregnant female that then gave birth, and that then led to the explosion eventually of all the different species. Tenrecs, as I mentioned earlier, this is a greater hedgehog tenrec. Again, another species there's a reasonable chance of seeing while in Andasi Bay. And some of the smaller carnivores, harder to see, but can be seen on occasion. This is the ring-tailed vontsera, which is found throughout the eastern rainforest, but is certainly something that, if we got lucky, we might see in Andasi Bay. But of course, the lemurs are the main draw, and none more so than the largest of the living lemurs, the indri. And Andasi Bay is the best place to see indri anywhere in Madagascar, and therefore, by definition, anywhere in the world. And there are several different parts of the reserve where different groups of indri are now really well habituated. If you wind the clock back to David Attenborough doing ZooQuest in the 50s, he had to search high and low with Charles Lagos, who was the cameraman, to find an indri that they could film, and it took them days, if not weeks, to manage to track one down. Now you're virtually guaranteed to be able to walk straight into the forest and find one. But that doesn't diminish from how spectacular they are to see and to experience. Renowned for their agility, able to leap prodigious, can't even say it, prodigious distances through the canopy, 10 to 12 meters. But if one thing defines or epitomizes an indri more than anything else, it's its song. If you go to a ridge in the rainforest within the vicinity of Andasi Bay early in the morning, one of the great features is listening to groups of indri singing and bouncing calls around from one area of forest to another. As one group starts singing, a different group responds, because this is a territorial call, and it's a sound quite unlike any other. I've likened it to a humpback whale sitting in a tree, and this wonderful, eerie, wailing call just rides on the breeze and can carry 2, 3 kilometers plus across the rainforest. And as I mentioned, when you're sort of standing on a ridge like this and 2 or 3 different groups call sequentially, it's really put hairs on the back of your neck, stand on end. It's one of the most magical experiences. And certainly listening to Indri and seeing them call is very much a feature of any visit to Andassi Bay, so something you could very much expect to experience during the festival. And as you can see from this shot, in certain places there are groups that are very tolerant, really well habituated, so the encounters that you're able to get with these wonderful creatures are spectacular. They're not the only lemur. There are numerous other lemurs in and around the Andassi Bay area. This again is one of the most spectacular, at least visually, the diadem sifaka, which is found not only in the main portion of the reserve, the Mantadia portion, but also now in the smaller reserve to the south. At one time, they disappeared from that smaller reserve, which is adjacent to where we will be staying. But over the last 20 years, they've been repatriated and are now breeding really well in that reserve. So can be seen not only in there, but in Mantadia and several other places as well, different areas within the vicinity of Andassi Bay. These wonderful lemurs can be seen. And again, they have become incredibly tolerant, or certain groups have become very tolerant. Not only do they spend time up in the trees, very occasionally they'll come down and play on the ground. And as this image shows, they really don't mind being viewed from close quarters at all. Some of the lemurs that are a little harder to see, but nonetheless rewarding. This is a red ruffed, black and white ruffed lemur. One of the areas, or 2 of the areas within the vicinity of Mantadia, are prime places to look for this. Harder to see, often heard, but harder to see, but certainly something that is a realistic possibility. And one of the great features of Madagascar is the option to go out at night into the forest and see a completely different cast of characters. Nocturnal walks are a real feature in Madagascar because there are nocturnal lemurs. This isn't a nocturnal lemur. This is one of the brown lemurs, but they are sometimes active at night. But there are specifically nocturnal lemurs. This is a dwarf lemur. Crossley's dwarf lemur, which is quite common in the Andassi Bay area. And as far as primates are concerned, one of the things that makes this group, the dwarf lemur group, really quite unusual is that they are obligate hibernators. They have to hibernate during the cooler part of the year. And some of the species that live in high mountain forests actually spend upwards of 7, 8, even 9 months of the year buried underground hibernating, and therefore are only active for 3, 4, 5 months of the year. This is a Crossley's dwarf lemur during hibernation, actually under the ground, which is obviously a behavior that's so unlike any other primate. One of 2 of the other nocturnal lemurs, this is a sportive lemur or lepi lemur. Obviously, this picture was taken during the day. They tend to spend the day either in or adjacent to a tree hole where they sleep, and then they're active at night. But again, one of the features of any night walk in Madagascar would be the chance to see lemurs like this. And other rarities that Andassi Bay is particularly renowned for. This is the hairy-eared dwarf lemur, quite a diminutive species. But when I first went to Madagascar back in the early 90s, there'd only been 5 records of this lemur for the previous century. And it had only been rediscovered in the late 1980s and was assumed to be on the brink of extinction. But as more and more research has taken place in Madagascar, more and more forests have been investigated, it turns out that that knowledge was, or that notion was based on wholly inaccurate knowledge. And we now know that this lemur is much more widespread. And while it's not common, it's at least more widespread and is seen more frequently. And Andassi Bay is one of the best places to see it. So it's still a treat seeing it because it's not a regular lemur to see, but it's still something you have a realistic chance of seeing on a night walk in the Andasi Bay area. Just to give you a little bit of sort of meat and drink background about a festival, we, as I mentioned, will be using two locations. This is the lodge that we'll be using in the Andasi Bay area. It's called Mantadia Lodge. It's one of the newest lodges in the Andasi Bay area. As you can see, a very good standard, beautiful rooms, very close to all of the main forest tracts and areas. So the closest forests are literally a couple of kilometers away from here. Even the most distant ones are no more than about 20 minutes drive away. So this gives us wonderful central access to numerous different patches of forest where we can see different things. And during the festival, you would have chance to visit numerous different patches of forest to get different experiences. But this will be a really terrific base for the half of the festival, the 4 nights that we would, or 3, 4 nights that we would be here. It's a lovely, lovely lodge. And the concept of the festival, for those of you who may not be familiar, is that we would have exclusive use of this particular lodge and the second lodge that we visit. So we would take this place over and run all of the festival events, as well as obviously the wildlife watching in all of the forests, the events that take place back in the lodge, the talks, the demonstrations, with the art demonstrations, sculpture demonstrations, the photography talks, the conservation talks, etc., would all happen back in the lodge. So I'm now going to move on to the second half of the main festival, which is the Anjajavi portion. I'm very conscious of time. I always tend to run over, but we're going to move back up onto that northwest coast and that star that's touching the coastline on that northwest coast, an Anjajavi private reserve, which we have to fly into, this wonderful coastal reserve, quite spectacular, and this absolutely fabulous lodge right on the beach, as you can see. Beautiful property surrounded by very different forest, western forest, completely different groups of animals, or variant, should I say, and all very, very accessible, which is one of the things that makes this place so wonderful. It's a beautiful place to stay, as you can see. The standards are very high, but a spectacular location with villas that obviously front onto the beach, forest behind, lemurs in the trees all around, birds all around. And as you can see from this slide, these slides, that the standard is very high indeed. It's a beautiful place to stay. And you can expect to see lemurs bouncing around in the trees very close to your villa, if not right next to your villa like this. This is one of the stars of the show in Anjajavi, the cockerel sifaka, beautiful lemur that is threatened across its range, which is only the northwestern portion of the island, but is very common and easy to see in Anjajavi, but is critically endangered if you take the population as a whole. But there are numerous groups in and around the lodge area and the adjacent forest that are completely tolerant and therefore very approachable. So one of the stars of the show, lots of bird life to see in and around the lodge. This is a magpie robin, a Madagascar magpie robin, a different sort of couas. Showed you a blue couas in the rainforest. This is a crested couas, which you tend to find more readily in the dry forests on the western side of the island, and a different vanga. One of the features of vangas, if you were to look at the group, which now numbers 20 plus species, if you were to line them all up on a single branch, you'd never in a million years think that they were all the same family, because they all look so different, particularly their beak shapes. This is a sickle-billed vanga, one of the largest, and it uses this fantastic beak to probe beneath tree bark and winkle out insect grubs, much like a woodhoopoe might do if you're familiar with African birds. Reptiles, again, I showed you a tree boa from the rainforest. This is a Madagascar ground boa, beautifully camouflaged, and again, a snake that you have a reasonable chance of seeing in Anjajavi. More lemurs, equally easily seen The brown lemur is highly visible and very easily seen in and around the lodge at Anjijavi. Endearing species, obviously, and at the time of year that the festival is running, not coincidentally, I hasten to add, all of the lemurs will have youngsters like this. So this sort of scene is something you could expect to witness. But as I mentioned, the stars of the show are, with respect to the lemurs at least, Anjijavi, the cockerel sifaka. And one of the things that you would hope to see is some of them bounding across the open spaces, which include areas of marshland between mangroves, because it's a coastal reserve, of course. But this is a mode of movement that they've perfected to allow them to move between one forest patch and another. As you can see, Anjijavi is a sort of mosaic of forest from the coast. There's mangrove and then drier areas. The mangrove areas are prime area for looking for fruit bats. There are colonies of fruit bats that roost in some of the mangroves because they offer significant protection. Um, um, when you're based at Anjijavi, there are various excursions that can be offered, and we'll be running these during the festival. One of the most spectacular is to a trip up the north up the coast for about half an hour to Maramba Bay, which is, as you can see, this beautiful inlet and bay area where there's spectacular forest coming down to the shore with baobabs and lemurs in trees and so forth. And it gives you a very realistic opportunity of seeing one of the rarest birds in the world, the Madagascar fish eagle, of which there are perhaps fewer than 70 pairs left. And there are at least 4 or 5 pairs that nest within the vicinity of Anjijavi. So seeing them along the coast, particularly on the trip up to Maramba Bay, is something that's very much a highlight. Night walks too in Anjijavi are excellent. Mouse lemurs, which feature in all of the forests around Madagascar, but there are lots of different varieties. They're virtually all, at least superficially, look the same, but they are split into different species. Um, um, the one in Anjijavi is called the Ambari mouse lemur, and it's only found in that area of the northwest. There are dwarf lemurs here as well, the fat-tailed dwarf lemur, which also hibernates during the colder months, but during November will have just become active. So this is a species we would probably expect and hope to see it having just woken up and started to become active again. One of the other things that's such a feature of Anjijavi, as I mentioned, it's a private reserve. And the people behind this reserve are working very closely with local communities. You can see here a little coastal village. This is actually the coastal village of Anjijavi. And they're working to expand the size of the private reserve. So they've acquired areas of land with forest adjacent to the immediate hotel vicinity. So as it's expanded, more and more forest is being protected, and they're working with local communities in as many ways as possible to provide work for the local community, so they get benefit from the lodge being there, and they get benefit from the forest being protected. One of the major conservation operations is a nursery cultivating all of the endemic trees and plant species from the region and then replanting to enhance the forest and expand the forest as much as possible. And all of the local communities are involved in this. There are also some really quite exciting reintroduction programs. At one time, there were giant tortoises on Madagascar, and there is now a program at Anjijavi to reintroduce the Aldabra giant tortoise, which was endemic or natural to Madagascar many thousands of years ago, but is now being brought back at Anjijavi, so wild populations can once again thrive on Madagascar. So this is a project that we would be able to visit during the stay at the festival. And there's equally, if not more exciting, there's a reintroduction program for aye-ayes. Currently, only 2 aye-ayes have been reintroduced. They historically were found in the forests of Anjijavi, but probably were hunted out by local communities at some point during the last century. But now with the cooperation of the local communities, eyes are being moved back into the area from unprotected forests into the protected forests at Anjijavi. As I say, only 2 individuals have thus far been moved, but the intention over the next 5 years is to bring others in to boost the population and hopefully, of course, eventually that they will breed. So there's some fantastic work going on in Anjijavi, and it's a wonderful example of coastal western forest. But as I alluded to, there are so many different forests around Madagascar that it's impossible to cover it all with just visiting a couple. So to get a greater appreciation, you have to visit other areas of Madagascar where you will see different things. And to that end, various extensions have been organised to run in conjunction with the festival. The first of which will run before the main festival. It's a pre-tour extension to the west of the island, to the central west, the Karindi area, Morondava area, which is primarily to visit the reserve at Karindi, which I'll tell you about in just a moment. But this particular area is famous for baobabs, the largest of all the Malagasy species, the Grondidier's baobab. This is the famous avenue of baobabs. This photograph was taken over 25 years ago. So it's a little more commercialized now, but this is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And it's one of the iconic places to visit in Madagascar. And you would pass through the Avenue de Baobab on the way up to Karindi Forest, which is this wonderful forest on the right-hand side, part of the broader Mena Bay forest, which is one of the best examples of western deciduous forest that is left. And this particular drone shot tells a story, and a very sad story, which plays out all across Madagascar. And that is the notion or the story of deforestation. You can obviously see on the left-hand side of the road where all of the forest has been cleared, because that left-hand side once looked like the right-hand side, but no longer does, because all of those areas have been cleared by local communities simply so they can plant crops to survive. Deforestation in Madagascar is not at the hands of giant timber conglomerates or anything like that. It's not big industry. It's simply local people trying to live. And that, of course, makes the conservation equation a much harder one to solve, because you've got to try and come up with ways that local communities can still live and survive without cutting down forest in order to preserve forest, like Karindi on the right-hand side of this shot. But once you go into western forests like Karindi, and you can see different baobabs dotted around here, this is a different species, Adansonia rubristipa. These forests are absolutely teeming with life, and fantastic places to visit. The pre-tour extension to Karindi is primarily going there to give those taking part a chance to see the fossa, Madagascar's largest carnivore, which Karindi is the best place to see this animal. It's an utterly spectacular creature. These shots were all taken at Karindi. These are pictures. The first 2 are a male. This is a female. And as you can see, fantastically agile climbers as well. And lemur, enemy number 1, they are primarily lemur hunters, but will eat anything. But in Karindi, 50% of their diet is lemur based. Some of the smaller carnivores that you might see, or one of the other smaller carnivores you might see in Karindi, is the narrow-striped bokkie or bokkie, which superficially resembles a mongoose, but isn't. It's one of the endemic carnivores that are part of the family that's unique to the island, the Eupleridae. Other peculiarities that you might see at Karindi include the giant jumping rat, the largest rodent on the island, which is about the size of a rabbit, is nocturnal, lives in burrows. But if you stake out a burrow, and there are generally ones that are known when you visit, you have a chance of seeing this wonderful creature. And lemurs too. This is a Verosiphaca, which again is a species that is readily seen in Karindi and is one of the main prey species for the fossa. spectacular leaping lemur. You would be unlikely to see this animal dancing across open spaces because in Corindi, because the forest is intact, but you certainly have a chance of seeing them leap through the canopy like this. Some of the endemic birds, yet another variant on the couas theme. This is the giant couas, which is about the size of a pheasant and is primarily terrestrial. And a real rarity that you might see in Corindi, this is a white-breasted mesite, which is there's a group that is endemic to the island. There are only 3 species. This one's restricted to the western deciduous forests, and its closest living relatives are perhaps the rails, but we're not quite sure. But this is a very, very peculiar group of birds, but certainly one that keen birders are very keen to see, not surprisingly. One or two of the other extensions that will occur after the main festival, the one that I'm involved with, which I'm going to gloss over simply because it's already fully booked, so I'm afraid there are no spaces left on it, but this is up to the very far north of the island to the region of Alanamera, where again there's a humid type of deciduous forest, different variant again. We're staying at this lovely lodge, and the main reason to go to this area is different lemurs again, one of which is Sanford's brown lemur, but the primary reason is to go and see Perrier's black sifaka, which is probably the rarest of all of the sifakas and is only known from this tiny area of forest way up in the far north, but a spectacular lemur to see. So if you are planning to go to Madagascar not on the festival, then I would very much recommend including Alanamera or Andavakura in your itinerary to go and see this particular creature. One of the other extensions is down to the south. I think this one's being led by Mike Dilger, who's also leading the pre-tour extension to Corindi. Mike's taking small group down to Isalu and Ifati. And again, you can see from this shot, this is Isalu, very, very different habitat again, just to show how varied Madagascar is. Dry, as you can see, but with ribbons of forest running along the watercourses where lemurs might be seen. Unusual vegetation. This is one of the elephant's foot plants that's endemic to the region. But the primary lemur reason for going to Isalu is the hope of seeing ringtails running around and clambering around on the cliffs and rocks. This is one of their strongholds. And then further south, down into the spiny forest in the southwest, where this amazing habitat, the spiny forest, occurs, dominated by octopus trees belonging to the family, the Didieraceae, a habitat unlike anything else, anywhere else on Earth. Lots of baobabs here too, again, different species to we'll have seen elsewhere on the island. This is Adansonia zar. And there are lots of endemic birds here as well. I mentioned the ground rollers when we were talking about Andasi Bay and 4 species that occur in rainforest. The 5th species is restricted to the spiny forest down in the southwest. This is the long-tailed ground roller. And some of the smaller, perhaps less conspicuous birds, but are also unique to this area. This is an Archbold's Newtonia. Chameleons too, a warty chameleon that's only found in the drier regions of the island, and yet another boa. This is Dumeral's boa, which is only found in the south and southwest, the drier parts of the island, but something that you might get lucky and see in the spiny forests at Ifati. And different tenrec again. This is a lesser hedgehog tenrec again. Were you to go out on a night walk at Ifati, this is something you would have a realistic chance of seeing. So on the extension that Mike's leading, I'm sure this would be something that you would do. The final extension is taking place on, if you look on the very northwest corner of the island, top left of the island, there's an island off the island of Madagascar, which is the island of Nosy Bay, which is the location for the final extension, which this is Nosy Bay, which, as I say, is this little offshore island and is one of the main beach sort of tourism um, areas, but is renowned for seeing a Mura's whale, which is one of the most recently described whale species. And this area off the northwest coast of Madagascar is a prime area for seeing Amura's whale. So if whale watching is your thing, this extension, which is being led by whale expert Mark Carwadine, who's obviously familiar to lots of you, and Chris Breen, this is one of the, if not the place in the world to see Amura's whale. So you're in, would be in expert hands with Mark, obviously taking you. Other cetaceans you might see would include spinners, dolphins, and if you get lucky, there's a chance of seeing whale sharks as well on daily excursions out into the Mozambique Channel, where these species are now readily seen, and turtles as well. I think this is a hawksbill. I'm not, maybe not. Maybe it's an olive turtle. You're staying on Nosy Bay in lovely accommodation, as you can see. Festival always does things in style, so lovely accommodation on the island of Nosy Bay for the whale watching extension. Um, so that kind of summarizes what the extension has to offer. Um, I know Ian's going to come back in now. We're going to have some questions. For those of you who've posed questions, I'm happy to answer, but I hope I've given you a nice broad overview, not only of Madagascar, but specifically what the Festival of Wildlife in Madagascar next year will offer. The main festival in Andasi Bay and Anjajavi, and then the various optional add-on extensions, either beforehand, the west for the Fusa, or the three ones that are taking place post the main festival to the different parts of the island. So I'm going to hand back to Ian now, who will take over, and I think we're going to have some questions as well. So over to you, Ian.
Thank you so much, Nick. That was absolutely fantastic. You just highlighted so much why visiting Madagascar is going to be like nowhere else you'll ever go. It's just nowhere else like it on Earth.
No, quite.
So
It is
thank you.
utterly unique.
Yeah, absolutely wonderful. Just before we get started on some of the questions, I'm just going to launch our poll. So if you would like to request a travel plan for the festival and the add-on extensions, that can be emailed to you if you just hold on a second. Okay, great stuff. So we've had some fantastic questions, Nick.
Okay, fire away.
Yeah, the first one I'll
Oh,
start with is um, regarding photography.
yeah.
What combination of lenses would you recommend for lemur photography in particular?
Okay, good question. Well, as you probably picked up from at least some of the slides I showed and what I was talking about and mentioning is in a lot of the locations, the lemurs and indeed much of the other wildlife is quite accessible, and there are groups of lemurs that are well habituated, which means, of course, you don't necessarily need long telephoto lenses. Um, Most of the photography I do now, lemur-based photography in Madagascar, I do with a 100 to 400 zoom because it's nice and light and portable. I do occasionally use a bigger, wider aperture lens. I now have a 400 2.8, which I know is a big, expensive lens and beyond the scope of a lot of people. In the past, I've used 300 2.8s and 70 to 200 2.8s. Very good lenses that would cover most situations. But as a general rule, I find the modern 100 to 400s work really well. Then apertures aren't as fast at 400 mil. Their fastest aperture is 5.6. But because modern cameras, modern mirrorless cameras now have such good focusing and such good high ISO performance, I find the necessity for really fast, wide open lenses isn't as great, and maneuverability and portability is obviously something that you have to take into account. So it's not necessary to have a 5 or 600 mil. The proviso would be, I mean, I'm talking about lemur photography here. The proviso would be if you're a keen bird photographer, then a 5 or 600 mil would come into its own. And some of the bird shots that I showed or have shown were taken with 5 and 600 mil lenses. So you might find a 300 or a 400 not quite enough for bird photography, but for most lemur photography, a shorter lens, even a 70 to 200 will certainly in places in Andasi Bay and Anjajavi would be more than adequate. A 300 mil or up to 400 would be fine. But for birds, you would probably still find a longer one would suit you or stand you in better stead in some circumstances. As for other wildlife, like the smaller things, the frogs, the chameleons, other reptiles, the invertebrates, a lot of the time you're looking at shorter macro lenses, a 100, 105 macro, or even a wide angle, so you can obviously take pictures of the subject in the context of its environment.
Brilliant. That's really helpful. Great insight. Thank you, Nick. Um, Another question is just about a rotation of activities, and will everyone get a chance to sort of do all of us at different activities on offer during the festival?
Um, that's a tough one to answer. I suppose the way festivals are normally pieced together is that prior to departure, everyone participating is asked to indicate what their preferences are, what their interests are, and as a consequence, that then influences the activities or the places that it's suggested they go to. Now, in Andasi Bay, for instance, everyone, of course, will get the opportunity to see indris and diadem sifakas and so forth, and some of the chameleons, because those occur in the readily accessible reserves, as well as the ones that require a little more physical effort and longer walks and so forth. Um, so there are some locations which may suit people who want to do something a bit more strenuous. And those who perhaps want to do or concentrate on things that are less strenuous will still have a chance to see all of the main things. Um, but there are too many things in Andasi Bay for everyone to be able to do everything. So you will have to pick and choose depending on your priorities. But you will certainly get opportunities to see all of the main things, go on night walks either in some of the accessible reserves or some of the more distant reserves where you may have to walk further. Some of the hills and slopes in those areas are steep. So again, you will pick and choose depending on your preferences and your um, capabilities, what you prefer. Um, but that will be sorted out prior to obviously the festival taking place. Anjajavi is easier. The walking in Anjajavia is flat, it's sandy. There are very few steep hills and inclines, and everything is so accessible there that I think all of the major things everyone will get an opportunity to be involved with in some way. And a lot of it will probably happen in a more ad hoc way for the simple reason there are lemurs that bounce around the grounds of the lodge on a daily basis, and therefore you will get fantastic lemur experiences, often just walking from your villa to the restaurant area, let alone having to go and walk off into the forest. So everyone will get a chance to be involved in all of the things they want to be involved in, I suspect.
Brilliant. Yeah, that's fantastic. There is another question that sort of you've covered much of it, but just regarding sort of the walking, and what would you say is the kind of minimum sort of walking sort of level that would be required, which I know is always tricky. Mm.
not a straightforward question to answer in the sense that in Andasi Bay, some of the locations are relatively easy. In all of them, there are slopes where, and some of which are quite steep, but the necessities, they're relatively short climbs and then flat areas. So those forest locations are easy to visit and are within the capability of the vast majority of people. And certainly, most forest walks would be 1 to 2 kilometers at most at a very modest pace, maybe a little further in some instances. Um, and you would just potter along. Guides will go out looking for things and then direct you towards a group of lemurs when something's found over here or over there or wherever it may be. In addition, there are locations in the vicinity of Andasi Bay where those wanting to do something a little more strenuous, a little more involved can visit. And those walks can be longer. We might be talking about walks of 4 or 5 kilometers, where some of the slopes will be quite steep. So they might not be everybody's cup of tea, but for those who want something a little more adventurous, that option exists. In Anjajavi, it's all very accessible, as I've mentioned. It's very flat by and large, so the necessity to walk up and down steep hills really doesn't exist. But it does get very hot there. You can expect temperatures into the mid-high 30s. So most of the best wildlife watching in Anjajavi is done early in the morning, late in the afternoon when it's cooler. And of course, that's when the wildlife, in particular lemurs, tend to be more active. So the activities are geared around not only the time that's best for the wildlife, but when the light is best for photography, and you're likely to have the best experiences. And of course, night walks after dark as well in both locations.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nick. One more. If someone has been to Madagascar before, they've been to Andasi Bay, Ranamafana, Isalo, where would you recommend as a next destination for them?
If they've been to Andasi Bay and Ranamafan, then those are obviously two of the principal, if not the two primary rainforest reserves. So there are other rainforest reserves that you could visit, which are a bit more involved or require a greater perhaps level of fitness, etc. Two that spring to mind would be the Maswal Peninsula and Marajeji, which are both up in the far northeast. Western forests like Anjajavi are worth visiting, obviously, as is Corindi, which is arguably the premier western deciduous forest reserve, along with a place called Ankarafansk, which is also in the northwest, has a similar group of cross-section of species to Anjajavi, but isn't on the coast. Um, there are the spiny forest areas down in the southwest and the extreme south, which, as I've alluded to, are so different. And now up in the very far north, there's a group of reserves that can be visited. I've mentioned Andavakura and Alanamira for the black sifaka. Adjacent to that, there is Ankarana Reserve, which is one of the Singi reserves, Singi being the limestone pinnacle karst, which forms a different sort of habitat. And also in the far north, there's Montandombra Reserve, which is a little enclave of rainforest, humid forest, where a different cross section of lemurs, chameleons, birds can be seen. So in the different regions of Madagascar, there are now lots of different places that you can visit with relative ease and piece together a very broad cross section of habitats and reserves and therefore species that you might see. It's impossible to do them all on one trip unless your trip was 2+ months or something. But on a regular sort of trip, which might be 2.5 to 3 weeks, you would pick 4 or 5 of those and piece them together depending on the domestic flight schedules or whatever it may be. Um, so you really pick them based on which species you want to see most and experience, because obviously that can be some of those species can be very site specific. If you want to see Fusa or especially a giant jumping rat, Corindi is the best place. Um, so you largely pick where you go based on what you want to see.
Great stuff. Yeah, thanks, Nick. That's really helpful. Um, and just one more regarding flash and whether would a on-camera flash be sufficient during night walks, do you think, or what's your advice for that?
Um, I guess that depends on camera flashes. If the if you're referring to the pop-up flash that some cameras have, then that's pretty limiting because they're very small and are really only designed to throw light up to a meter, and obviously that therefore limits what you may be able to realistically photograph with a pop-up flash on a camera. Frogs, possibly, chameleons, that sort of thing, but not really lemurs, etc. If you want to photograph lemurs, you'd have to be looking at a bolt-on flash, something that you would then put onto the hot shoe that has a greater amount of power and therefore can throw light over a greater distance. Um, Flash obviously is a very intricate subject, and it's a bit of a how long's a piece of string. You will get workable results with the smaller things with a pop-up flash. You would get better results with a flash that you would put onto the hot shoe because it has more power and therefore would throw light much further and allow you to illuminate subjects that were further away. And you would get better results still if you then were able to take that flash off the camera and fire it in with a remote setup. So the flash gun wasn't on the same axis as the lens, and therefore you wouldn't get red eye reflection in your photographs. Now, all of those are obviously adding degrees of intricacy. That's something we covered during the photo workshops, during a festival, for instance, for those who want to delve into the intricacies of using flash and getting more sophisticated with flash. But you certainly will get some workable results with a pop-up flash or a flash on the hot shoe of the camera. You start then to get better results once you move further, deviate from that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nick. That's really helpful. Yeah, we've got one more slide. So yeah, our next talk will be A Year in Pictures with Mark Carvedine and Emma Healy on the 25th of February. And I think that's all the questions we've had this evening. So yeah, I'd like to thank you, Nick, for outstanding talk.
Been a pleasure as ever.
Brilliant. And thank you all for joining us this evening. We hope to see you again soon. And yeah, have a good evening. Thank
Cheerio,
you.
everyone. Hey, Peoniseg. Have a good evening.
Good evening, everyone.